Hi there. I'm just kind of reporting in to say I haven't fallen off the face of the earth. I I can only teach if the Lord actually gives me something to say, because otherwise it's just confusion. And I have tried to do numerous videos in the last week that I've ended up just deleting because I didn't have rest or release. If I can't get my spirit out when I'm speaking, I'm not going to be teaching. Um, in other words, if it doesn't flow confidently, then I pretty much just wait. And this is an interesting season because I'm just waiting. Um, but I do want to check in and say hi. I've been practicing for this Air Force band thing, so I've been pretty busy with that. But I want to say that I have wanted to say that when it comes to the matter of doctrine, correction typically, from my experience and what I see in the Word, is more of a public matter than you might think. And here's why. If somebody is caught up in doctrinal error, it is because something's not functioning correctly yet in their conscience with respect to the truth and to the Word. Now, it could be a matter of growth, or it could be a matter of having been taken captive. Okay? Uh, and, when the Bible talks about false doctrine or false teaching, it uses words like winds of doctrine, seducing spirits, doctrines of demons, systems of error. You don't have the sense that this is something that you're fully in control of, and that you have a sober mind. Now, the reason I say all that is because what I've found in my experience is that when you try to deal with someone who's in error doctrinally, in a private situation, because they are wrapped up in error and being tossed, they can't perceive the conversation accurately either, unless it's by some supernatural miracle that they get clarity. So that means that the private conversation you have with that person is going to might likely be misconstrued, misinterpreted, misunderstood, and then mischaracterized, especially if they don't receive the truth and become offended because they're already in the mind of the flesh. Now, I'm not talking about minor things. I'm talking about doctrines related to salvation. Okay, they, from my experience, the people who are in error when it comes to core issues related to salvation have been captivated by something that has got them in the mind of the flesh, and their response is to be offended, to misunderstand, misinterpret everything you say, and then broadcast that misinterpretation. Then the only proof that you have that you didn't say the things that they're telling people you said and all that is the conversation itself. And if you have emails, great. But if you start sharing those emails, now you're a talebearer. Now nobody can trust you. Now you are taking that which is in confidence and broadcasting it. And people say you're adding to the draw. You can't win. So now I'm not talking about someone who's in error doctrinally because of what they believe. Believing is one thing. I'm talking about people who are in error doctrinally because of what they teach. Once you're teaching, it's public. You are influencing people's view of Christ and his work. Again, I'm not talking about minor secondary issues. I'm talking about those core things related to our salvation. What we see in the scripture is that this is dealt with publicly. And the example I'm thinking about is Peter shrinking back from the Gentiles when the Jews from James came for fear of the persecution for being with the Gentiles. He shrinks back from the Gentiles and stops eating with them, thus sending a message to the Gentiles that, hey, this gospel thing, that it was of faith without works. Actually, I was sinning when I did that. Now that the Jews are here from Jerusalem, I don't want them seeing me do this because I'm wrong. Which means, yeah, you got to become a Jew and you need to be ceremonial clean. Uh, that was a huge message from someone who was an ambassador of the truth. So that's why Paul had to rebuke him publicly. It says, before them all. I rebuked Peter publicly before them all because he was in error. And he gave him a big lecture about justification by faith, which Peter already knew. It's not like he was telling Peter something new. He was clarifying the truth for everybody who was affected by it. And Peter received the correction. Peter's good at receiving correction. He's got a lot of experience with it. Now, if Peter was a Judaizer or a wolf, it might have been a different story. Paul might not have dealt with it that way, but he knew Peter could take it as a brother, I think. And so it turned out to be a good situation. Peter was converted and strengthened by it. It's not like Peter learned something new there. He was just re-established in a more strong way to justification by faith. And then he was able to contend for it in Acts 15 with Paul, speaking up to all those Jews that he was previously afraid of because of that correction. So it was a good thing. But yeah, it had to be public. Now, here's the thing. What I've seen is that when you correct someone who's teaching error and they don't take it well, what they like to do is use Matthew 18 and say, well, you're supposed to go to your brother in private. And then if they don't listen, then you bring two witnesses. And then if they don't listen, then you bring it to the church. And then if they don't listen, you treat them like a Gentile. And they say, because you didn't deal with it privately like that, you weren't walking in love, you weren't following Matthew 18, therefore I don't have to listen to you. And they play a victim card that you like attacked them. If you call them out publicly. Well, the thing is Matthew 18 doesn't apply to teaching, it applies to offenses. It's when your brother sins against you. It's about restoring relationship that's based on personal offenses and bringing mediators in to help. The idea is to restore two brothers that are at odds. Teaching is different. Teaching is public and it affects people. And here's the thing. They'll say, well, it's not loving. You know, you should remember where you came from and you had false doctrine too at one time. Yeah, we all came out of the legalism and stuff. But want to know why we were in legalism for so long? Why did it come out? You know, from my experience, I kept getting clear about justification by faith, but then I would go into another church where they taught a mixture of stuff and eventually I'd be brought captive to it. And the reason was because they used this love, they used the love walk as a way to stifle dissent. And you weren't allowed to bring these things up. And so the reason we stayed under legalism for so long was because no one would stand up and speak against what was being taught. There was no clear voice. There was no clear trumpet to say, this is the way you should go. So everybody was just left to, be uncomfortable and try to deal with it in their own heart and not bring it up because you don't want to offend anybody. And while you're doing that, you're in a lukewarm state and your ability to clearly hear the truth and discern it from the error is actually compromised. You actually damage your conscience because you are going along with error for the sake of keeping unity. So yeah, I do remember all the bondage I was in from false teachings and false beliefs. And I know what helped me get clear was getting out of that environment, number one, and being willing to expose the error. It was when I started exposing error and contending for the truth that I became clear. Paul says to the church in Philippi, he says, as much as you are in your defense and confirmation of the gospel, you are fellow partakers with me of grace. There is a defense and confirmation of the gospel that has to be going on. The gospel comes out with much contention. If you see in like the church of Thessalonica, Paul talks about how, you know how we preach the gospel with much contention. Why? Because it goes against every natural, philosophical, and traditional teaching of men, and is truth in contrast to this sea of error that we're all swimming in. And for that reason, it has to be contended for boldly, or else the error will just the error, these strong winds just carry people away, you know. So yeah, here's the thing: a hireling sees the wolf coming and flees, but the good shepherd lays his life down for the sheep, right? And that's Christ, of course. But there should be this sense that, look, my care for the church is more pressing than my fear of getting the smackdown for exposing this person's teaching. See, we get it reversed and say, well, we need to love that person and remember how you were in error, and they need to be dealt with gently because, none of us are without sin. Sin and doctrinal error are two different things. Everybody has personal sin that they're dealing with, and we're supposed to go to our brother and restore them in a spirit of meekness, watching ourselves lest we be tempted. But then when it comes to someone who goes beyond the doctrine of Christ, we're not even to receive them in our house. We're not even supposed to say, God bless you, according to John. So there is a distinction between erroneous doctrine and struggles with the flesh. When it comes to the person and work of Christ and making the gospel clear, that's something we fight for and we contend strongly. Sometimes we're not being strong enough, So what I've seen is that I've tried to go to people in private, and in every case it's backfired and blown back, and then everybody has a misperception of what it is I said. I look like the bad guy, they look like the victim. So it's better to do it in public, I think. Now, I'm not thinking I'm going after anybody right now. I'm just speaking about some recent experiences where I brought something up privately. It was not received well. I brought something up publicly and I was rebuked for not walking in love. But either way, this person was referring people to erroneous doctrine, whether they even knew it or not. And, we have to answer for our teaching. We have to be prepared to defend our teaching. And if you come across a teacher who's not willing to listen, and I'm not talking about listening to wolves and opening yourselves up to people who are clearly wrong in the gospel. I'm saying if you know somebody who has the gospel correct, is coming to you and asking questions about your teaching, then you should be able to explain it. And I can explain what I teach. I defend it. I do clarifying videos as well. So like you'll see me teach something, and based on a bunch of, questions, if I feel like it's not clear enough, I will do another video to clarify or even present a fuller, more broad balancing word. I've done balancing words where it's like, okay, now what I said was true, but you also need to take this into account, because you have to keep, a teacher has to show every side of it. You have to keep going at it until your conscience is satisfied. And what I've seen is that there are people who are grace believers who will get themselves into teaching error, and they don't know that they're teaching error, but then when you bring it up to them, they take it as a personal attack. And the reason they do is because they are caring more for their ministry, their brand, their name, than for the people they're ministering to. And they don't care about the fellowship in the body. They don't care about the church. They care about their appetite. So, Paul said there are many. He said, I tell you now, even weeping, that there are many who walk as enemies of the cross of Christ, whose God is their appetite. And I don't know that he's just talking about Judaizers and non-believers. I think he's talking about people who really have not been through anything with the Lord, and they started teaching or started pursuing their own aim in, quote, ministry, and they're influencing people. You wouldn't have to be warned about them and avoid them if they weren't actually peddling something. There are a lot of YouTube channels of people who really have not done their homework in the Word and have not been through experiences of discipline where they've learned what the flesh is and why it has to be condemned to the cross. And these are the ones where they'll be able to tell you the gospel real clear, but they're also focused on something else that they may even exalt higher than the Word. And they can get caught up into different things, not intentionally, but what's revealed is when you then try to expose it, they completely respond in the flesh and tear you a new one. And it's because they have not condemned their flesh to the cross, and they are defending their own righteousness. They think their ministry is their righteousness, and they can't divorce themselves from it. And they get emotional, and then they start doing damage control and start telling people their bad impressions of you and twist it. And I'm talking about grace believers who aren't, so I'm saying, yeah, it doesn't help when it comes to doctrinal issues to address it privately. You need witnesses who can say, this is how that conversation actually went. Okay, well, and that is one of the reasons why I've been silent for a few days. This has been on my heart. This is something, that I've seen and experienced a number of times recently. Since my YouTube channel, and even before, and all the churches I got kicked out of. You're always branded as like you're not walking in love because the only person that they're thinking about is themselves. No, it costs me something to address error. It puts me at risk because there's going to be blowback when you get offended and you start talking about me and spreading rumors about me behind my back and telling people I'm a cult leader or whatever. That's one of the reasons why we don't always expose error. That's the reason why we were in bondage for so long, was because no one wanted to stand up and speak the truth and say, no, this is the right way, that's the wrong way, for fear of blowback, for fear of retribution, for fear that they might offend somebody, for fear that maybe they're wrong. Who am I? I'm susceptible to weakness too. You get into that kind of thinking because the enemy likes to conflate personal sin with doctrinal error and say, you could be just as susceptible to it. And that's true. All the more reason to contend for the truth. All the more reason to defend against error and make the way clear. All right, well, I got to get going.